I arrived early, which surprised even me. I'd been late to most things in my life, school meetings, work dinners, apologies. But this was my daughter's wedding, and for once I wanted to be ahead of time, standing quietly at the edge before the music began, watching the room fill with laughter and nervous excitement. The morning sun reflected off the polished windows of the venue, casting long bands of light across the gravel driveway. I parked farther away than necessary, partly out of habit, partly to give myself a moment to breathe. I sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the faint echo of voices drifting from inside. It felt unreal that the little girl who once fell asleep on my chest during thunderstorms was now starting a life of her own. I straightened my jacket, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and rehearsed the smile I'd been practicing for weeks, the one that looked calm, supportive, proud. I told myself not to overthink it. Today wasn't about me. It never was. It was about her happiness, her future, her choices. Whatever tension existed between us, whatever misunderstandings had piled up over the years, today was supposed to be different. Weddings were meant to soften hard edges. They were meant to bring people together, even if only for a few hours. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed a decorative stand placed just outside the main doors. At first, I assumed it was a seating chart or a welcome sign, something tasteful with calligraphy and flowers. Guests were slowing as they approached it, some smiling, some pausing longer than usual. A few whispered to each other. I thought nothing of it. Weddings always had small bottlenecks, people searching for names, checking schedules, adjusting outfits. Then I saw my face. It took a second for my mind to process what my eyes were seeing. The photo was unmistakably me, cropped from an old family picture, slightly faded but clear enough that there was no doubt. Beneath it, in thick, bold letters, was a single word printed on a bright strip of paper. I stopped walking. For a moment, I honestly believed it had to be some kind of mistake. A joke, maybe. A prank taken too far. I looked around, half expecting someone to laugh and explain that this wasn't what it looked like. But no one laughed. A woman near the sign glanced at me, then back at the photo, then quickly looked away. A man behind her shifted his weight, pretending to check his phone. The air around the entrance felt heavier than it should have, as if everyone had silently agreed not to say anything. I stepped closer. The sign was deliberate, carefully placed, laminated. My name was printed beneath the photo in smaller text, confirming what my face already told the story of. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was intentional. I felt heat rise up my neck, my ears burning as if the sun had suddenly grown harsher. My first instinct was anger, sharp, immediate, demanding. I imagined tearing the sign down, storming inside, demanding answers in front of everyone. I imagined shouting, forcing the truth out into the open. After all, what kind of person bans their own father from their wedding? What kind of explanation could possibly justify this? But just as quickly, another feeling followed, something colder, heavier: embarrassment. People were watching now, not openly, but enough. I could feel their eyes flick toward me and away again, as if acknowledging me would somehow pull them into the situation. They didn't know the story. They didn't know me. All they saw was a man whose own daughter had decided he wasn't welcome. I wanted to disappear. A younger version of myself would have reacted badly. I knew that. I had a history of reacting before thinking, of letting my temper speak for me. It had cost me plenty over the years. Relationships, trust, moments I could never take back. I'd promised myself I'd grown since then, that I'd learned. Standing there, staring at my own face labeled like a warning sign, I realized this was the ultimate test of that promise. I searched for my daughter through the glass doors, hoping, ridiculously, that she would appear, that she would see me, that she would rush out and explain everything. But inside, the room buzzed with preparation. People moved chairs. Someone adjusted flowers. Someone laughed too loudly. Life went on, completely unaware of the small, humiliating disaster unfolding just outside. I thought about knocking, about asking for someone, anyone, to tell me what was going on, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of the answer. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that whatever explanation existed, it wouldn't erase the fact that this sign had been made, printed, and placed for all to see. This wasn't a conversation meant to happen in public. A memory surfaced then, uninvited. My daughter at 12 years old, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, telling me I never listened. I'd laughed it off at the time, told her she was being dramatic. I'd had work stress, deadlines, responsibilities. I always did. Looking back, I wondered how many moments like that I'd brushed aside, how many warnings I'd ignored because they were inconvenient. Another memory followed, her graduation, where I arrived late and missed her name being called. She'd smiled when she saw me afterward, said it was fine, but something in her eyes had shifted. I remembered promising to make it up to her, promising to do better. Promises were easy. Consistency was harder. Standing there now, I wondered if this sign was the sum of all those moments, condensed into a single, unforgiving word. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. I didn't want to see sympathy messages or awkward questions. I didn't want to explain myself to anyone, especially not when I didn't fully understand what I was being accused of. I took one last look at the sign, memorizing it in a way that felt painfully permanent, then slowly turned away from the entrance. I expected someone to stop me, to ask if I was okay, to say something, anything. No one did. As I walked back toward my car, each step felt heavier than the last. The sounds of the wedding faded behind me, replaced by the dull thud of my own thoughts. I didn't cry. Not then. I was too stunned, too focused on staying upright, on not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing me break. I got into my car and sat there, staring through the windshield without seeing anything. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that whatever story had led to that sign, whatever version of me existed in my daughter's mind, was powerful enough to erase me from one of the most important days of her life. And as I finally drove away, a single question repeated itself over and over, louder with every mile. I drove without direction for a long time. The road signs blurred past. Towns announced and dismissed before I had time to register their names. At some point, the anger returned, not explosive but simmering like a pot left too long on low heat. I replayed the image of that sign again and again, searching for some hidden detail I'd missed, some clue that might make it all make sense. Who made it? Who approved it? Had my daughter stood there, watching as someone taped my photo into place? Or had it been done without her knowing? The questions circled endlessly, each one cutting deeper than the last. Eventually, I pulled into a small parking lot beside a diner I used to stop at years ago when work took me out this way. The place hadn't changed much, same chipped blue paint, same neon sign flickering even in daylight. I sat in the car for a while before going in, trying to steady myself. I didn't want to look like a man who had just been publicly rejected by his own child. I wanted to look ordinary, invisible even. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried eggs wrapped around me, familiar and grounding. A waitress I didn't recognize gave me a polite nod and poured coffee into a mug already waiting at the counter. I didn't order food. I just sat there, hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my fingers. For the first time since leaving the venue, my phone buzzed again. This time I looked. There were messages. Some from relatives I barely spoke to anymore, others from people I hadn't expected to hear from at all. Most were cautious, carefully worded, as if they were stepping through a minefield. Are you okay? I don't know what's going on, but I'm sorry. Call me when you can. There was one message I didn't open right away. My daughter's name sat there on the screen, unread, heavy with possibility. I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering, heart pounding harder than it had at the entrance of the wedding. Part of me wanted to open it immediately, to finally hear her explanation. Another part of me was terrified that whatever she'd written would confirm my worst fears, that this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a final judgment. I took a breath and opened it. It wasn't long, just a few lines. I didn't want it to be like this. I needed to protect my peace today. Please don't make a scene. We'll talk later. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a boundary drawn with quiet firmness. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. Protect my peace. The phrase stuck with me, sharp and accusatory. From what? From me. I wanted to argue that I had every right to be there, that I was her father, that I had sacrificed plenty over the years. But as quickly as those thoughts formed, something else followed. A small, uncomfortable voice reminding me that intentions didn't erase impact. I thought back over the years, not in a neat timeline but in fragments. The arguments that ended with doors slammed. The phone calls I didn't return because I was tired or distracted. The way I dismissed her feelings when they didn't align with my logic. I'd always believed I was being reasonable, teaching her resilience. Now I wondered how often she'd heard indifference instead. The waitress asked if I wanted a refill. I nodded automatically. She smiled, unaware that she was witnessing a man quietly dismantling his own self-image. I had always told myself I wasn't a bad father. Flawed, yes. Stubborn, definitely. But not bad, I provided. I showed up when it mattered, or at least when I thought it mattered. I loved my daughter deeply, even when I didn't understand her. But sitting there, reading her message again, I began to see that love, when poorly expressed, could still leave wounds. Another message came in, this one from my ex-wife. We hadn't spoken much in recent years, keeping communication strictly practical. Her words were direct, as they always were. This didn't come out of nowhere. She's been trying to tell you how she feels for years. I closed my eyes. Of course she had. In her own way, she'd been clear. I just hadn't listened, not really. I'd heard her words but filtered them through my own defensiveness, my own need to be right. It was easier to believe that she was overreacting than to consider that I might be the problem. I paid for the coffee and left the diner, the bell over the door ringing softly behind me. Outside, the sky had shifted, clouds gathering where the sun had been earlier. It felt appropriate. I leaned against my car and let the cool air hit my face, grounding me again. I thought about going home, about ending the day quietly, but something stopped me. If I went home now, I knew what would happen. I'd stew in resentment. I'd replay the humiliation until it hardened into bitterness. I'd convince myself that I was the victim, that I'd been wronged beyond forgiveness. And maybe I had been hurt, but I didn't want that hurt to calcify into something that would permanently sever whatever fragile connection remained between me and my daughter. So instead, I drove to the place where so many of our conflicts had started, my old house. I hadn't lived there since the divorce, but I still owned it. I'd kept it partly out of inertia, partly out of nostalgia. Walking inside felt like stepping into a preserved version of my past. The furniture was the same. The photos on the walls hadn't changed. My daughter's childhood was everywhere: school pictures, art projects, trophies from sports she no longer played. I sat on the edge of the couch and let the memories wash over me. I remembered teaching her how to ride a bike, running behind her until she found her balance. I remembered sitting up all night when she had the flu, counting her breaths. Those moments were real. They mattered, but so did the ones where I'd failed her. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a painful possibility, that the sign at the wedding wasn't meant to punish me but to protect her. That from her perspective, my presence, even silent, even well-intentioned, represented stress, unpredictability, or emotional labor she couldn't afford on her wedding day. That realization didn't erase the sting, but it changed its shape. I didn't sleep much that night. When I did drift off, my dreams were crowded with unfinished conversations, words spoken too late or not at all. By morning, I felt drained but oddly clear. I couldn't undo what had happened. I couldn't force my way into her life or demand forgiveness on my timeline, but I could choose what I did next. I picked up my phone and started typing a message. Then I erased it. Then I tried again. Eventually, I wrote something simple. I hear you. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I won't push. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here." I didn't send it right away. I read it several times, making sure it wasn't defensive, that it didn't contain hidden justifications or demands. When I was satisfied, I hit send. I didn't know if she'd respond. I didn't know if it was enough. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving forward instead of clinging to my version of the past. The wedding would go on without me. Pictures would be taken. Memories would be made. I would exist only as an absence, a gap no one spoke about openly. That hurt more than I cared to admit. But if my absence allowed her joy, maybe that was the role I needed to play, at least for now. As the day wore on, I sat quietly in the old house, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood carrying on as usual. Somewhere, my daughter was saying her vows, stepping into a future I wouldn't witness firsthand. And for the first time, I understood that love sometimes meant knowing when to step back, even when it breaks your heart to do so. The house felt different the next morning, not haunted exactly, but heavier, as if the walls themselves remembered arguments that had never truly ended. I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck and a dull ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes from emotional exhaustion more than lack of sleep. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then everything rushed back at once. The sign, the word band, the unread spaces where I was supposed to exist in my daughter's wedding day. I sat up slowly and rubbed my face, grounding myself in the quiet. My phone lay on the coffee table where I'd left it. No new messages. I told myself not to read into that. Healing, if it was even possible, wouldn't happen overnight. Still, a part of me had hoped, irrationally, that I'd wake up to some acknowledgement, some sign that my message hadn't disappeared into a void. I made coffee in the kitchen, using the same chipped mug I'd always used when she was growing up. It struck me how small habits outlived relationships. The house had remained patient, waiting for me to notice what I'd missed. As I leaned against the counter, staring out the window, I realized something uncomfortable. I'd spent years insisting I wanted honesty, but when it had arrived, I hadn't liked the form it took. Late that morning, curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of me. I opened social media. Photos from the wedding had already started appearing. My daughter looked radiant, exactly as she should have. Her smile was genuine, unburdened. The groom stood beside her, proud and steady. Friends commented with hearts and congratulations. Family members praised how perfect everything looked. I studied every photo carefully, not to find myself, because I knew I wouldn't, but to see if she looked at peace. She did, and that complicated things. It would have been easier in some twisted way if she'd looked conflicted or sad. Her happiness forced me to confront a painful truth. My absence hadn't ruined her day. If anything, it may have improved it. That realization hit harder than the sign ever had. I closed the app and set my phone aside, my chest tight. I thought about all the times I'd framed our conflicts as mutual misunderstandings, as failures on both sides. Now I wondered how often she'd been carrying the weight alone while I congratulated myself for being open to talk. In the afternoon, I went through old boxes in the hallway closet. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I needed something to do with my hands, something that felt purposeful. I found school report cards, old birthday cards, drawings she'd made with my name written in uneven letters. One card stopped me cold. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, she'd written, "I like it when you listen to me." I sat on the floor and laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was devastatingly simple. She hadn't asked for perfection. She hadn't asked for grand gestures. She asked to be heard. That evening, there was a knock at the door. I froze for a moment, heart racing with possibilities. When I opened it, my ex-wife stood there, arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. We regarded each other in silence for a few seconds, years of shared history suspended between us. "She asked me to check on you," she said finally. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where we'd once planned birthdays and argued about bills. Time had changed us both, smoothing some edges, sharpening others. "She's not trying to hurt you," my ex-wife said gently. "But she's done trying to explain herself over and over." This was her way of making sure the day stayed about her. "I know," I replied, surprised to find that I meant it. "I didn't understand before. I'm starting to." She studied me for a long moment. "Understanding is good, but it's only the beginning." After she left, her words lingered. Only the beginning. I'd spent years believing insight alone was enough, that once I got it, things would naturally fall into place. Now I saw how wrong that was. Insight without action was just another form of avoidance. That night I wrote a letter. Not a text, not an email, a real letter. I didn't plan to send it right away. I just needed to say things fully, without the constraints of a screen or the fear of immediate response. I wrote about the sign and how it made me feel, but I didn't accuse. I wrote about my mistakes, naming them plainly without excuses. I wrote about loving her in ways that hadn't always been useful or kind. I wrote until my hand cramped and my vision blurred. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, writing her name carefully on the front. I set it on the mantel where it would wait until, or if she was ready. Days passed, then weeks. Life resumed its shape, though it felt altered, like a familiar song played in a different key. I went back to work. I answered messages. I smiled when required, but something inside me had shifted. I listened more to coworkers, to friends, to the quiet discomfort that arose when I felt defensive. Each time I asked myself what I was protecting and whether it was worth the cost. One afternoon my phone buzzed with a message from her. Just 3 words. I read it. I didn't respond right away. I let myself feel the relief, the fear, the cautious hope. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. "Thank you." That was all. I didn't know what would come next. Reconciliation wasn't guaranteed. Trust, once broken, rebuilt itself slowly, if at all. But for the first time since the wedding, I felt something that resembled peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer pretending nothing was broken. I had arrived at my daughter's wedding, expecting to be seen as a father. I left learning how to become one. The letter stayed on the mantel longer than I expected. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a kind of quiet truce between hope and restraint. I resisted the urge to reach out again, reminding myself that silence, for once, might be the most respectful response I could offer. I had spent years filling space with explanations, corrections, and defenses. Now I was learning what it meant to leave space open, uncomfortable, uncertain, but honest. When her message finally came, I read it. It didn't resolve anything, but it cracked the door open just enough to let in air. I replayed those 3 words over and over, measuring what they didn't say as carefully as what they did. She hadn't said she forgave me. She hadn't said she understood. But she also hadn't shut me out completely. For where we were, that felt monumental. I began therapy shortly after. It wasn't something I announced or dramatized. I just made the appointment and showed up. The first few sessions were awkward, full of long pauses and half-finished thoughts. I was used to presenting myself as competent, reasonable. Sitting in that room, I had to confront parts of myself I'd ignored for decades. My reflex to control conversations, my fear of being wrong, the way I equated authority with love. Numbing those patterns was uncomfortable, but also oddly relieving. It gave shape to things I'd felt but never understood. The therapist asked me a question that stuck with me. When did you first learn that being right mattered more than being close? I didn't answer right away. I thought about my own father, strict, distant, convinced that discipline was the same as care. I'd sworn I'd be different, and in many ways I was. But I'd carried his voice with me all the same, mistaking firmness for presence, logic for empathy. Realizing that didn't excuse my mistakes, but it helped me see where they came from. Months passed. My daughter and I exchanged occasional messages, brief, careful, respectful. We talked about neutral things at first, work, weather, small updates that didn't carry emotional risk. Each exchange felt like stepping onto thin ice, testing whether it would hold. I followed her lead, resisting the urge to push for more. Patience, I was learning, was an action, not a passive state. One afternoon, she asked if I'd like to meet for coffee. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. My hands shook as I typed yes. Whenever you're comfortable. We agreed on a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. I arrived early as I had on her wedding day, but this time there was no sign waiting for me, only the soft hum of conversation and the smell of roasted beans. When she walked in, I barely recognized the mix of confidence and caution in her posture. She smiled politely, not warmly, and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I resisted every instinct to fill the silence. "I want to say something," she began finally, "and I need you to just listen." I nodded. She talked about years of feeling dismissed, of having to brace herself before difficult conversations. She talked about the wedding, not as an act of revenge, but as a boundary she felt she had to enforce to protect herself. Hearing it from her, directly and calmly, stripped the event of its dramatic edge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about safety. When she finished, I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I thanked her for telling me, and I apologized, without qualifiers, without defenses. It was the hardest thing I'd done in a long time. The conversation didn't fix everything, but when we stood to leave, she hugged me briefly but genuinely. I sat in my car afterward, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply, letting the moment settle. It felt fragile, like a bridge newly built, not meant for heavy traffic just yet. Driving home, I thought about the man I'd been when I arrived at her wedding, certain of my role, blind to my impact. That man believed presence alone was enough. I was beginning to understand that presence, without attunement, could still feel like absence. I didn't become a different person overnight. I still caught myself wanting to interrupt, to correct, to assert. But now I noticed those impulses before acting on them. I paused. I chose differently. Change, I realized, wasn't a declaration. It was a series of small, deliberate decisions made again and again. The wedding day would always carry a sting. There was no rewriting that moment, no reclaiming the photos I wasn't in. But it no longer defined the end of my story with my daughter. Instead, it marked a painful beginning, a point where denial finally gave way to accountability. Sometimes I still think about the sign at the entrance, about the word that stopped me in my tracks. It was brutal, yes, but it was also honest. It forced me to see myself through her eyes, stripped of my justifications. And in that clarity, as devastating as it was, I found the first real chance to change. The weeks that followed were quiet but purposeful. I began keeping a journal, something I'd never done before, not seriously. Each entry wasn't about grand events or dramatic confessions. It was about observation, reflection, and accountability. I wrote about my reactions, the things I said, the things I left unsaid. I cataloged small victories, moments when I paused before responding, moments when I truly listened. And I cataloged failures too, because pretending they didn't exist would only make them repeat. Writing became a kind of practice, a way to untangle the knots of old behavior and slowly retrain myself. Each page was a confrontation with the man I had been, and a promise to the man I wanted to become. One evening my daughter called. Not a text, not a message, but her voice. The sound of it was familiar, yet carried a weight I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I sat on the couch, hands gripping the armrests, listening to her recount the mundane events of her week, the things that mattered to her, not to me. There was laughter, small frustrations, updates about work and friends, but beneath it all there was a careful tone, testing the waters, gauging my reactions. I didn't dominate the conversation. I didn't offer unsolicited advice or correct her perspective. I simply listened, asked clarifying questions when appropriate, and responded with honesty and respect. That night, for the first time in years, I felt the fragile threads of our connection shift. They didn't bind fully yet, but they had presence, subtle and promising. Therapy continued to be an anchor. We delved into patterns of behavior I had long ignored, my defensiveness, my impatience, my tendency to frame arguments as battles rather than opportunities for understanding. There were sessions when I left feeling raw, exhausted, questioning everything about myself. And then there were sessions when small epiphanies emerged, moments when a single observation or question illuminated months, even years, of habitual mistakes. I learned to separate intent from impact. I learned to hear criticism without perceiving attack. I learned to sit with discomfort rather than run from it. Each lesson was incremental, building on the previous, and I began to see real growth, not just in theory, but in my daily life. Meanwhile, my daughter began sharing more, not everything, but enough to show she trusted me cautiously again. She invited me to help with minor preparations for her new home, to attend small family gatherings, to be part of everyday experiences. I accepted cautiously, understanding that my presence was still conditional, still under scrutiny, but I embraced the chance nonetheless. Each visit was careful, measured, often awkward, but it carried significance. I noticed her subtle shifts, the way she glanced toward me for approval, the way she, in conversations with family, the way she smiled when I offered quiet support. Each observation became a small victory, a reminder that trust could be rebuilt, even if slowly. There were moments of regression, naturally. Days when old insecurities crept back, when pride tempted me to justify my absence at the wedding or rationalize past mistakes. During these times, I leaned on the practices I had cultivated: journaling, therapy, self-reflection. I reminded myself that progress was not linear, that mistakes did not erase effort, and that humility was a continuing requirement, not a single achievement. I learned to accept discomfort as a companion in growth rather than a signal of failure. Slowly, the emotional turbulence that had once defined my interactions with my daughter began to settle into a calmer rhythm. Eventually, our conversations evolved. We began discussing deeper topics: personal challenges, family dynamics, future plans. She opened up about her fears, her aspirations, and even the ways in which my past behavior had shaped her perceptions of relationships. Listening to her, I felt a mix of sorrow, understanding, and determination. Sorrow for the pain I had caused, understanding for the struggles she had faced, and determination to never repeat the patterns that had led to this fracture. I realized that being present as a father was no longer about attending ceremonies or asserting authority. It was about consistency, empathy, and the ongoing work of relationship repair. One weekend, she invited me to accompany her to a community event she had organized with her colleagues. It was informal, not a wedding or celebration, but a space where she held authority and exercised her independence. I agreed, knowing that my role was limited and that my presence should support rather than dominate. Throughout the day, I observed her leadership, her interactions with others, her confidence. Pride welled up quietly within me, tempered by humility. I saw the woman she had become and the resilience she carried, traits that were partly reflections of my influence and partly forged in response to my shortcomings. I recognized that my role was evolving from one of oversight to one of quiet support, from a figure of authority to a partner in trust. By the end of that day, as we walked together back to her car, she paused and turned to me with a tentative smile. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. No grand declarations, no dramatic apologies, just acknowledgement. I nodded, understanding the weight of what had been said. The sign at the wedding, the word ban, the humiliation, it had been painful, but it had forced a reckoning I might never have initiated myself. I realized that growth often arrives wrapped in discomfort, and love sometimes requires stepping back before stepping forward. In that moment, I felt a quiet sense of hope, fragile but real, that the fractured pieces of our relationship could continue to mend with patience, humility, and presence. Time passed, and the rhythm of our tentative reconciliation settled into a quiet, steady cadence. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden declarations of forgiveness, but rather a slow, deliberate rebuilding. We met for coffee, shared meals, and attended small family events. Each interaction was an exercise in restraint and attentiveness. I had learned to listen without interrupting, to offer guidance only when requested, and to recognize the difference between being helpful and being overbearing. It was exhausting in its own way, but there was a satisfaction in doing the work correctly, step by careful step. I began noticing small signs of trust returning. She started asking for advice on practical matters, organizing her home, planning minor events, managing finances. These requests were carefully measured, but they were requests nonetheless. It struck me how much influence I had lost when I had not listened, and how much work it took to earn even this small measure of confidence. But I didn't push for more. I celebrated these incremental victories, understanding that any misstep could undo weeks of careful progress. During one of our meetings at her apartment, she shared a memory from her wedding day, a detail I hadn't known about. A guest had questioned her about my absence, attempting to stir drama, but she had calmly deflected the attention, protecting the sanctity of the day for herself and those around her. Listening to her, I felt a mixture of pride and remorse. Pride for her strength, her ability to protect herself and maintain control of the day. Remorse for the part I had played in creating the environment that made such defense necessary. It was a bittersweet revelation, but an important one. I realized that part of being a responsible parent was acknowledging that my actions or inactions could have unintended consequences, sometimes far beyond my immediate perception. I also began to reconnect with my extended family cautiously but intentionally. My daughter encouraged it subtly, inviting us to shared meals or community gatherings, observing carefully how I interacted with others. I noticed that my behavior had changed, not only with her but with everyone. I was less reactive, more reflective. Where I had once sought to dominate conversations or assert authority, I now prioritized understanding, patience, and empathy. In those moments, I realized that reconciliation with my daughter had become a catalyst for broader personal transformation, a ripple effect that touched not just one relationship but many. One evening, we attended a small local concert together. It was casual, nothing extravagant, but it provided an opportunity to simply be present with each other without expectation. We laughed at shared jokes, commented on the music, and discussed future plans. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of familiarity returning, albeit in a new form. I caught glimpses of the daughter I had known in childhood, interwoven with the adult she had become, and I felt a profound gratitude for the opportunity to witness her growth firsthand. The wedding, the humiliation, the sign, it no longer held the power it once had. Instead, it had become a reference point, a reminder of how far we had come. I reflected on the lessons learned, the importance of listening, the necessity of patience, the humility required to repair what was broken. The experience had stripped away illusions of control and authority, leaving behind the more challenging but ultimately rewarding path of genuine connection. In quiet moments, I would think about the future, her future, mine, and the space between us. I knew that full reconciliation would take years, perhaps decades, and that trust, once fractured, demanded continual effort to maintain. But I no longer feared the effort. I understood that the depth of love for my daughter required more than presence or intention. It required vigilance, empathy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. By the end of the year, the weight of that moment at her wedding, the word band, the humiliation, had transformed from a source of pain into a catalyst for growth. I had learned to listen, to reflect, and to act with purpose rather than reaction. My daughter and I were still building, still cautious, still testing the boundaries of trust. But each interaction, each conversation, each shared experience was a brick in a bridge we were reconstructing together. And for the first time since that day, I felt confident that the bridge would hold. The following months were a testament to patience, humility, and the slow rebuilding of trust. My daughter and I continued our cautious steps toward each other, each interaction measured yet sincere. No one celebrated milestones publicly. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Instead, it was a series of small, intentional acts, sharing a meal, attending a community event, exchanging thoughtful messages that reinforced a new pattern of connection. It was far from perfect, but it was steady, deliberate, and real. I noticed subtle shifts in our dynamic. Where there had once been tension or unspoken resentment, there was now space for understanding. Conversations flowed more naturally. I no longer approached her with assumptions or defensiveness, but with a willingness to hear, to validate, and to respond thoughtfully. In return, she allowed glimpses of her vulnerability, trusting me cautiously but consistently. Each moment of trust was fragile, yet it strengthened the foundation of our renewed relationship. One quiet evening, she invited me to help her organize a charity event she had taken a leading role in. It was not a wedding, not a family celebration, but a space where she exercised independence and leadership. I accompanied her, fully aware that my role was supportive, not central. Observing her confidence, dedication, and compassion, I felt immense pride tempered by humility. I realized that my influence as a father was now most meaningful when exercised quietly, without assertion, allowing her autonomy to shine. We spoke openly about the past, not to relive pain but to acknowledge it. She shared the emotions surrounding the wedding, the reasoning behind the sign, and the ways she had felt compelled to protect herself. I listened, uninterrupting, validating her experiences without defending my own. It was a lesson in restraint and empathy, and one I embraced fully. Through these conversations, I began to understand the depth of her perspective and the subtle ways my prior behavior had shaped her decisions. I accepted that reconciliation required not just apologies, but consistent demonstration of understanding and respect. Gradually, the painful memory of being labeled banned transformed from a source of shame into a catalyst for growth. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, my parenting, and the impact of my actions. I learned that love sometimes required stepping back, that presence without attunement could be damaging, and that accountability was an ongoing practice rather than a single statement. Each day, I made conscious choices to listen, to reflect, and to act with care, understanding that my daughter's trust would only deepen through sustained, genuine effort. Over time, laughter returned to our interactions. We reminisced about lighter moments from her childhood, shared personal successes, and even disagreed occasionally without conflict. Each interaction strengthened our bond, teaching me that trust rebuilt slowly is often more resilient than trust untested. The journey was not linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and lingering fears, but the overall trajectory was forward, toward connection, understanding, and mutual respect. Looking back, I understood that the wedding, the humiliation, and the sign were painful but necessary turning points. They revealed fractures in our relationship that had long been ignored, and they forced me to confront my own shortcomings with clarity and honesty. The experience reshaped the way I engaged with my daughter, teaching me patience, empathy, and the power of consistent, thoughtful presence. Most importantly, it reminded me that love is not merely a feeling but a daily practice, a commitment to understanding, listening, and acting with care, even when it is uncomfortable or challenging. I no longer saw that day as a mark of failure but as a beginning of reflection, accountability, and transformation. The bridge between my daughter and me, once fractured and uncertain, was slowly being rebuilt, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, act by act. And while we both understood that the past could never be undone, we also understood that the future was ours to shape together, patiently, humbly, and with unwavering care.